lovely to see all of you here today. It's really nice to see everyone, and I imagine from different parts of the country, if not the world. I'm here in my son's bedroom, and I have 2 sons, 2 cats, and a wife. So even though the door is locked, you never know if there's going to be a distraction. So I'm just kind of putting that out there up front. It's just nice to see everyone's faces, and there will be an opportunity during the latter part of the webinar today to chat comments as we complete a collective group matrix together. But we are leaving the microphones off just because of the sheer number of people that are on the webinar here and continuing to join as I speak. So I'm going to get started here in sharing my screen. And give me a second here. And so hopefully what you see is the title slide here. And John, if that's not the case, feel free to let me know.
You're all good.
Okay, good. And so I'm going to move over this box here, getting settled in. Okay, so as John mentioned, I'm a peer review trainer with the Association for Contextual Behavioral Science. That's essentially what I call the mothership of ACT, of Acceptance and Commitment Therapy. Wonderful community and full of resources in case you're not already a member of ACBS. And the website is contextualscience.org, contextualscience.org. So the title of today's webinar is The ACT Matrix, an adaptable application of acceptance and commitment therapy. And I'm going to go with the assumption that there are folks on this webinar who are already familiar with acceptance and commitment therapy and those who are not. So I will be giving a very, very brief overview of what acceptance and commitment therapy is, but then we'll be jumping into the matrix for the majority of our time together today. So John already mentioned I work at Sutter Health. That's an integrative medicine program. I'm there Monday through Thursday full-time as a psychotherapist. I work alongside functional medicine practitioners and nutritionists and acupuncturists. I also have a small private practice in Davis, California, where I see individuals and couples, adolescents and adults. I don't work with young children. I have young children, but I don't work directly with young children. So most of my experience comes from working with adolescents and adults. I've worked in a variety of settings over the years, including crisis, a halfway house, a lot of dual diagnosis work with mental health and substance use issues, outpatient and community settings. I was working at Kaiser Permanente for 12 years prior to coming to Sutter Health. And I also provide individual coaching and consultation, both on acceptance and commitment therapy and on other contextual behavioral approaches. Okay, so although there are no formal learning objectives for today, these are 3 objectives that I'm putting out there. And my hope is that by the end of this webinar, you'll have a good sense of, or a good understanding of all 3 of these objectives. So the first one is we're going to perform a functional contextual assessment of behavior with the ACT matrix. And for those of you new to ACT, we'll get into what we mean by function and context. And the word assessment, I think, is kind of interesting in that the matrix can, in fact, be used as part of your assessment process with clients and patients. In fact, although I usually do a standard biopsychosocial assessment in the first session I have with patients at Sutter Health, my second session often involves using the ACT matrix, where together with the patient, we develop a matrix. And it's then used as a reference for our work together going forward. I find it can provide a useful metaphor to refer back to. And specifically as a way of helping our clients and patients um, to better understand the function of their behavior. So when they do X, Y, or Z, what is it that they're trying to get out of that behavior? What is it that they're trying to move toward or get away from, which we'll get into? And what are the effects of that? Like, what are the effects of their behavior? Ultimately, it helps to build a sense of awareness so that they can make more flexible choices in their lives guided by their values going forward. We'll utilize the matrix to formulate and deliver therapeutic interventions. In the introductory ACT course I'll be facilitating starting September 11th, which is on Friday afternoons as well, through Praxis. We'll get into more detail in that course for those of you who are interested in signing up with regards to interventions, specifically identifying interventions from relational frame theory, which is the theory of language and cognition that underlies ACT, and looking at how these RFT can help inform powerful interventions that we can use in the clinical context to help promote awareness and change in behavior. And then we'll look at how to compassionately undermine unworkable experiential avoidance. I realize that's a mouthful. Experiential avoidance essentially refers to any behaviors where we are attempting to avoid, control, get rid of, or eliminate our painful private events, AKA our thoughts and feelings. We will be unpacking this today as we go through this. And unworkable in that even though such choices or behaviors can provide short-term relief, it's often at the cost of long-term effects. So there's usually long-term costs. And so we get into what we refer to as stuck loops. And then we'll also look at how to reinforce or make it more likely that our clients will engage in values-guided actions. And we'll do that through a process of augmenting using what we call verbal AIKIDO. So that's what we have in store for today. First things first, what is ACT? I have found that nearly every single session or every single new patient or client, so you'll notice me using those terms interchangeably, depending upon the setting that I work in, and I imagine the settings that you work in. But I find that I introduce ACT differently every time. But generally speaking, I will say something to the effect of, this is a collaborative skill-building approach where we will be looking at how you relate to your thoughts and feelings, and together developing more flexible ways of responding to those thoughts and feelings so that you can more freely choose to do what matters in your life, right? So that's maybe one introduction. Another way I might say it is, ACT is a mindfulness-based, values-directed approach, or something along those lines. According to Stephen Hayes, who's the originator and co-developer of ACT, he says that in theoretical and process terms, we can define ACT as a psychological intervention based on modern behavioral psychology, including relational frame theory, that applies mindfulness and acceptance processes and commitment and behavior change processes to the creation of psychological flexibility, which brings us to that question: what is psychological flexibility? This is the overarching aim of ACT, to cultivate and or enhance psychological flexibility, which is our ability to contact the present moment more fully as a conscious, aware human being, aware of what we're experiencing within ourselves and aware of what's happening around us as well. And then changing or persisting, depending upon what the situation affords, changing or persisting in behavior when it serves valued ends. In other words, changing or persisting in behavior that helps us to move towards living a meaningful and fulfilling life. This is our one overarching agenda that we kind of walk in the room with when we are working with clients and patients from a perspective of acceptance and commitment therapy. So now on to the matrix. That was my brief introduction to ACT. The matrix is a point of view, a perspective, and literally a diagram designed to cue psychological flexibility by noticing and sorting the differences between moving toward values versus away from painful private events, i.e. the function of our behavior. So in other words, if I, in presenting this webinar today, I might ask myself, what values am I moving toward in doing this? Well, the first value that comes to mind is contribution. It's important to me to be contributing to people's lives and to the field of mental health. So we can ask ourselves in any given action or choice that we make, is there something meaningful about that choice? And if so, what values might I be moving toward? And we contrast that with away from painful private events, AKA experiential avoidance. That's the technical term, which means anything I do to try to get relief from, push away, suppress, control, avoid my uncomfortable thoughts and feelings, whether that be anxiety or thoughts of like, I'm not good enough, or whatever might be showing up for me on a given day. And so there we're looking at the function of our behavior. And then the other sorting differences is occurring with the context of our experience. And we can broadly divide our experiences into two contexts. The external context, which we engage with the world through our five senses. I might refer that to our external or outer experience, or more specifically in behavior analytic terms, it's overt behavior, behavior occurring out here. Just like me speaking right now, or if you're writing something, or if you're watching, that's overt behavior. And then we have our inner or covert behavior. Now in ACT, and more specifically, the philosophy that underlies ACT, functional contextualism, we view thoughts and feelings as behavior. And I get, for those of you who are new to this model, might have a different orientation when it comes to thoughts and feelings. But in ACT, we view all of it as behavior. And we can refer to that as covert behavior, or internal behavior, or private events. All different terms pointing to the same thing. This is the matrix, at least a version of the matrix, the version I'm currently using. You'll notice at the bottom it says adapted from Kevin Polk, Jerome Hambright, and Mark Webster. I believe they developed the matrix somewhere between 2006, 2008, somewhere in there, if I'm not mistaken, maybe 2005. And there have been many versions of the matrix that have come out since then. What you'll most commonly see are the words toward and away. That's usually what's common. At the center here, you might see words like me or self or observing. I often will put noticing, because that's the main sort of skill that I am, or functional class of behavior that I am looking to shape with my clients, to help them become really good at noticing their thoughts, feelings, values, and the choices that they make in the presence of those experiences. So, and then for the vertical axis, you see outer and inner. Once again, you might see external, internal, and traditionally, you'll see at the top, you'll see five senses experiencing, and at the bottom, you'll see mental experiencing, and you'll see me unpack this shortly. And then finally, you usually will not see terms here. I like to add them in here because when I'm doing the matrix with a client and filling it out on the screen through telehealth, which by the way, The separate slide that John referred to that's uploaded on the Praxis site, which you do not need any of that for the webinar right now, but it's available to you whenever you want. But that separate slide by itself is what I use in telehealth sessions. And you'll see me doing that with you together today shortly. But so anyway, I put words purpose and pain here just to point us to what we're referring to. Pain being painful private events, difficult thoughts and feelings, and purpose being our values, in that our values can give us a sense of direction and a sense of meaning and purpose with regards to living our lives and the choices that we make. Okay, so we're going to start by unpacking the vertical axis here, which once again represents the context of our experience. And we can broadly divide our contexts and our experiences into two contexts, outer and inner. Outer being our how we contact the world through our five senses, what we see, hear, touch, taste, smell, and do with our body, moving and talking and dancing and anything we might do with our body. We would call that overt behavior. And so what I'm going to invite everyone to do is to just pause for a moment, and I'm going to take you through a very brief, simple experiential exercise to help for us to discriminate the difference between our outer versus inner experiencing. So what I would like everyone to do is, and for those of you who have had exposure to matrix training in the past, part of this will be a familiar exercise to you. But if you have access to a pen, I'm going to invite you to grab that pen, to hold that pen in your hand. So go ahead, grab a pen if you have access to one. If you do not have access to a pen, you can grab any object you have nearby. But ideally, you're using a pen only because I'll be referencing a pen as we go through this. And so what I'm going to invite you to do first is to simply look at the pen, okay? And you might even hold it up, or at least as long as you can see it, and notice what that pen looks like, okay? So imagine that you've never seen a pen before, and so you are exploring this pen with a sense of openness and curiosity, open and receptive to what the pen has to offer, and curious, not the kind of curiosity like I got to figure this out, but rather a kind of a gentle, passive curiosity. So looking at the pen, noticing its shape, noticing the colors, noticing the design. I'll invite you to feel the pen in your hand. Notice what it feels like in your hand. Once again, noticing the shape and the texture. Parts where it is rougher or smoother. If it has a grip, noticing that. Noticing any words or documentation on the pen. And then I'll invite you to tap the pen against something nearby. Just gently tap the pen against your hand, against a desk, your chair, whatever you have nearby, and notice what that sounds like. I will not ask you to smell or taste the pen. Of course, you are welcome to if you like, but I'm not making that suggestion. So now I'm going to ask you to put the pen down. I could see people smelling it. Cool. I'll ask you to put the pen down. And now I'm going to invite you to close your eyes or look away from the pen. The point being to not have the pen in your sight. So ideally, you would close your eyes. But if that's uncomfortable for you for whatever reason, you're welcome to leave them open, but just gaze away from the pen. Now I'm going to ask you to picture the pen in your mind, reflecting upon what it looked like just a moment ago. And then imagine you are holding the pen again. So you're not actually going to pick it up. Just imagine you're holding the pen and what it would feel like in your hand again, possibly recalling what it felt like just a moment ago. And then now I'm going to ask you to imagine you are looking at the pen, however, from 20 feet away. The pen is now 20 feet away from you, right? So maybe the length of like 2 bedrooms. 20 feet away from you, you're looking at the pen from a distance. Imagine what it would look like if you were to do that. And finally, I'm going to ask you to imagine that you are tapping the pen against an empty metal can, like a soda can. Once again, tapping the pen against an empty metal can. And imagine what that would sound like if you were doing that. And then feel free to open your eyes, come back to the room here. And what you likely notice were a few things. First, there is a difference between interacting with something in the world as it is versus interacting with that object or that stimulus mentally. There's a difference there, right? And at the same time, the functions or the properties of what you experienced in the world out here can be transferred onto your inner world, in that you were likely able to recall to some degree what the pen looked like and what it felt like in your hand, having just had that experience. And why is that significant in mental health? Well, it cuts across every single mental health issue you can imagine. And just for a moment, taking as an example trauma, anything we experience in the world around us, whether it's something we witness or experience directly, emotionally, physically, sexually, those experiences in the outer world, of course, the functions of what we experience, the effects of what we experience can get transferred onto our inner world. And we can carry those around with us wherever we go, right? So that's significant. And something else you may have noticed, which is even though you did not interact with this pen in the outer world by tapping it against an empty metal can, you were probably able to do so in your inner world. In other words, you were probably able to imagine what that pen would have sounded like if you had tapped it against an empty metal can. And why? Well, relational frame theory explains that we can relate any two stimuli or events together, even if they've never been related before through the world of our 5 senses. So because you've had an experience with an empty metal can in the past, and you've had the experience with this pen, you are able to relate them together to notice that if I were to tap it against the can, this is what it would sound like, right? You coordinated those two things together and then had a new experience with new functions internally. And that's significant too, because once again, coming back to trauma, if I, let's say, experienced a car crash in the past, and mentally, let's say that now I'm in a different car and driving down the road, and I hear something as I'm driving that reminds me of that car crash, I might be starting to relate different stimuli together that were never part of that original experience, and yet can still have traumatizing effects on me. Okay, now we're looking at the horizontal axis, which represents the function of our behavior. And what I'd like you all to do is to imagine a bunny rabbit living out in the wild. Imagine a bunny rabbit living out in the wild. What kinds of things would a bunny rabbit want to physically move toward in its lifetime? Now, if we didn't have over 200 people on this call, I would be asking you for your input. And when I do this individually, when I do this in a group setting, I will ask for volunteers' input. Same thing with the pen exercise. But what kinds of things would a bunny rabbit want to physically move toward? You might imagine food, right? Or shelter, or other bunny rabbits. Um, and then we can look at, well, what would a bunny rabbit want to get away from in its lifetime? So what kinds of things would a bunny rabbit want to get away from? And you might reply with predators, right? So larger animals, people, storms, or threatening weather elements. And notice that all of those responses, and these are generally the responses you'll get from clients, have to do with survival, right? Have to do with survival. And they're occurring in the outer world, the top half of our matrix here. And as humans, of course, we also exist in that world. And we are also very, very interested in moving toward food and shelter and other people, right? For bonding, connection, and reproduction, and moving away from predators and threatening weather elements and things like COVID, etc. Right? So um, for survival purposes, these kinds of toward moves and away moves are important to us too. However, unlike the bunny, we have that very, very sophisticated inner world, right? The world of thinking and feeling and storytelling and memories. And because of this sophisticated inner world, we also have an interest in other kinds of toward moves and away moves. So, including our pain, difficult thoughts, feelings, urges, and sensations, thoughts, self-limiting beliefs about ourselves, judgments about others, fears, worries, shame, guilt, all of this inner world experiencing, also including physical pain and other uncomfortable physical sensations where we might not have a name for that. And so as humans, we also engage in away moves related to these difficult thoughts and feelings. So to get a taste for this experientially, just for a quick moment, what I'm going to ask you to do is very briefly again to close your eyes or to look downward. And I want you to scan your body from head to toe. So mentally scan your body from head to toe. And of course, I should also say every single, these are all invitations, all invitations. You can choose freely to not engage in this exercise or any other exercise we do here. But if you're willing to mentally scan your body from head to toe, on the lookout for any uncomfortable feelings. A feeling in this case could be an emotion or any other physical sensation like chest pressure or tightness or upset stomach. And once you have discovered an uncomfortable feeling, emotion, sensation, this might be a little strange, but what I'm going to ask you to do is to firmly say no to it. Imagine you are to yourself, you can say it out loud if you wish, but to firmly say no to whatever it is you're feeling. It's as if you're trying to push it away, to get rid of it. And just notice what that's like. Notice what it's like to firmly say no to something in your inner world. And then you're welcome to open your eyes again if they're not already open. And I'm going to guess most of you likely noticed that there was a tension that showed up, like an inner conflict that showed up in saying no to it, or at the very least an awkwardness or a discomfort in trying to push away your inner experience. Now, some of you, and this is the case with our clients and patients, when I do this in a group of like 20 people, there will be 3 or 4 group members who will say, actually, they liked saying no to it, in that they felt like they were getting away from it and getting a little bit of relief from the feeling by denying it. And so we wouldn't dispute that. In fact, we would validate that. Okay, so sounds like you got a little short-term relief from pushing it away. And then we'll get into the longer term effects of that briefly. But the point is to just notice our experience with saying no to it, which is usually it creates a struggle within us. We're adding a layer of pain to our existing pain, right? And I like to say that pain plus struggle is equals suffering. And so when we say no to our pain, through that struggle, we are bringing on suffering for ourselves. Even though, just like the bunny rabbit trying to get away from the predator, it feels like the natural, intuitive thing to do. However, can we learn to treat these thoughts and feelings like guests? Guests that occasionally come to visit. And just like if we were to have actual guests in our home, some guests come and go very, very quickly. Other guests like to stay around a little longer. Some guests are neat and tidy and pleasant to be around, and some guests are messy and unpleasant to be around, right? But either way, at least in the beginning, just consider how you would treat a guest in your home. Perhaps you might treat that guest with some respect or at least some openness, right? And can we do that with our inner world, even with our difficult thoughts and feelings? And in doing so, what we might discover is that especially with emotions like sadness and shame and guilt and fear, that there's a vulnerability there. There's a vulnerability there in those feelings that if we can sit with them long enough to tap into um, the data that these emotions have to offer, we might find something really meaningful in these feelings, in that our values and our vulnerabilities are poured from the same vessel, in the words of Kelly Wilson. So by leaning into staying with our feelings and using the matrix, as we will shortly, we can uncover values through our painful feelings. Not always, not all the time, but that's often the case. And so we can learn how to hold our feelings once again with a little curiosity and openness. All right, so now I'm going to invite you, we're going to do a little experiment with a toward move. Okay, so now I'm going to invite you to close your eyes again or to gaze downward. And this time, I'm going to ask you to bring an image to mind of someone or something, so a person or a pet, that you hold dear in your heart, someone you deeply care about. And ideally, this would be someone or something that is alive today, but it doesn't have to be. It could be someone from the past. I'll leave that up to you. But bring an image to mind of a person or a pet that you hold dear in your heart, that you care about. And I want you to imagine that you are moving toward this person or pet to give them a hug. Imagine you're moving toward this person or pet to give them a hug. Notice what that feels like. See if you can sense that in your body. Imagine you're holding the person or pet closely to you, embracing them, smelling what they smell like, feeling them in your arms. And just notice what that's like. And as I take a brief view of everyone on the call right now, I see a lot of smiling faces, and I also see other emotions showing up for people too. And then I'll invite you to open your eyes again, coming back to the room. And we can call that a toward move, in that you took a step. Now, of course, that was a verbal or cognitive step of moving toward your values, what you care about, what matters to you. And most of you likely notice that felt meaningful and fulfilling in some way. And some of you may have noticed that a little bit of other vulnerable feelings showed up as you made that toward move. You may have noticed some stuff showing up over here, and that is normal. And why? Because once again, we hurt where we care and we care where we hurt. So if that person or pet is someone you deeply care about, and there has either been a conflict of some kind, or you haven't seen them in a while, or you're concerned about their well-being, there may have been some sadness or other uncomfortable feelings showing up, right? And this is what we're working on with our clients and patients. Can we move our lives in a direction that matters to us while making room for thoughts and feelings that, instead of viewing those thoughts and feelings as a threat, as a predator? Okay. So getting more specific now, once again, what we were looking at was painful private events, uncomfortable thoughts, urges, emotions, and sensations. That's what goes on the lower left part of the matrix here. And when we do away moves, these are behaviors under the aversive control of painful private events. Now, I never use the term aversive control with patients or clients, but what we mean by that is that our choices, or what we do in the presence of those painful private events, are under aversive control. I mean, the painful private events are exerting stimulus control over our behaviors, meaning because they're uncomfortable, we are doing things to try to get away from, relief from, or try to control those difficult thoughts and feelings. And we would call those away moves. The technical term for this in ACT is experiential avoidance. And oftentimes we get this short-term relief. So for instance, if I'm feeling particularly anxious and I have a couple of alcoholic drinks, I might get some short-term relief from the anxiety. And we call that negative reinforcement. Negative doesn't mean bad. Negative means we have taken something away that we didn't like, or in this case, negative just means something has been taken away. And reinforcement means that we are more likely now to do that behavior again because of the relief we got from doing it. So in other words, the next time I feel anxious, I might recall, I got relief when I had those couple of drinks. And that might make it more likely that I will do it again. So my behavior has been negatively reinforced because of the relief I got from taking those few drinks, as an example. But notice we can end up in this cycle here, which is that, so I have the anxiety, I take a few drinks, or let's say I have social anxiety and I opt out of some social engagement or opportunity. Or let's say I have shame, and let's say we cut on ourselves. So we might get this little bit of relief from doing so. And so, however, when we have those drinks, or when we cut on ourselves, or when we disengage from social activities, there usually is a cost to doing that. The cost could be simply about our values. We end up neglecting our values, especially if socializing is important to us, for instance. And at the very least, these difficult thoughts and feelings tend to come back around, whether it's a few hours later or the next day, or in the case of, let's say, cutting, before I felt ashamed, now there's maybe more shame or more painful feelings or self-criticism coming up on top of that. So we end up creating costs from engaging in these away moves, and that feeds what's happening down here. And so we end up in what we call a stuck loop, where we are attempting to get short-term relief, but with a long-term cost. So we say it's unworkable in the long run because it's making our problems worse in the long run, and it is not in line with our values, with being the person we ultimately want to be, which is where we go on the right-hand side here. So on the lower right part of the matrix, we have our values. Our values being freely chosen qualities of action, or qualities of being and doing, how we want to be and relate to ourselves and to the world around us, desired ways of behaving, our heart's deepest desires for who we want to be. So these are our values. Now, for those of you who have had exposure to the matrix in the past, you will likely have noticed that this lower right quadrant is taught differently by most trainers. In that they usually will simply ask who or what is important to you. That is the standard question in the lower right side here, who or what is important to you. If you ask that question, you will typically get responses such as people and domains in our life, like work or health, things like that. Um, and so I have found that you'll see shortly when we go through how we set this up in sessions, I ask those questions differently because I'm aiming to get at these qualities that they want to embody and enact upon in their lives. And then we build the matrix from there typically. Don't have to do it from there, but typically. So that's kind of my approach towards the matrix, which is different from most people. And then once again, upper right here, when we do toward moves, what we mean by that is our behaviors are under the appetitive control of our values. Appetitive essentially meaning appealing or what we are moving toward. So I mentioned earlier, well, let's take the example of my sons who are doing distance learning right now. And so that my morning was spent helping my 6-year-old son with his schoolwork. And I do that because, and so when I'm helping him with his schoolwork, well, of course I want to be helpful, but it's really about more than that. Like I really care about his education. I want to be attentive to him. I want to be present with him. I want to be flexible. And that's probably a big challenge for me. So he gives me that opportunity to practice being flexible because he wants to change things up and do things his own way. And I also admire that too. So my point being that when I engage in those behaviors with him, I am moving towards certain values of attentiveness, care, being present, just as an example. Okay. And this evokes positive reinforcement. Positive in that something is being added to our lives. You could think of positive like the plus sign, add, and negative like the subtraction sign. So something's being added to the quality of our lives. And it's reinforcing because this in itself can be meaningful and fulfilling. All right. So as long as I can consciously connect what I'm doing in a given moment to those values, this in itself can be intrinsically reinforcing. And this is what we are working to do with our clients. Okay, so putting this all together, and probably the most important part of the matrix is what we find at the center, which is our observing self. Observing self is another term for self as context, which is the technical term in acceptance and commitment therapy. There are many other names, like flexible perspective taking is another way of looking at self as context. And once again, the main skill or functional class of behavior we are looking to shape is noticing, essentially. So we're looking at helping to shape this sense of observing by asking our clients to step back and notice where they're at on the matrix in any given moment of any given day of any given situation. So when you said X to your husband, wife, partner, child, when you said that, Do you think that was an away move or a toward move? Was that you moving toward being the person you want to be? Or were you caught up in a difficult thought or feeling that hooked you? Hooked you is a term for essentially when we get pulled by a painful private event into doing an away move. So was that an away move when you said X, Y, or Z to that person? And so they become more aware and more able to discriminate their own behaviors. And this gives them more flexibility in their choices. And that's the coolest thing about the matrix. If we even, I usually use this in one session with patients. I usually use this in the second session. Sometimes I'll bring it back up for a future session, but oftentimes I like seeing them, their facial expressions as close as possible and not having a diagram on the screen for every session. That's me. But I do find a lot of value in using this at least once. And we'll refer back to it in the future. And they tend to get on their own. They'll come back and say, I noticed myself doing lots of toward moves this week, right? And that's been feeling good. I've been noticing the effect or the impact that's having on my life. And we'll explore that together. Or, yeah, I got caught up in those away moves again. And I watched the effects, I noticed what happened. And afterwards, I didn't feel so good. This more stuff was coming up down here. Or even though it's not on the matrix, they might even say, and my daughter, distanced herself from me afterwards. And that's another effect that they're noticing of their behavior. Okay, so now we're going to transition into a case presentation. And this is a composite of like 3 different people I have worked with over the last 6 months. So the identities have been, there's no identities revealed in any of this. Everything has been kind of disguised for confidentiality purposes, but it's a composite of 3 actual people I worked with. So let's imagine a 40-year-old adult Black or African-American female nurse and mother of 2 young children who's feeling overwhelmed during the pandemic, okay? And she reports heightened anxiety. She's feeling very tense, and she reports frequent worry, which is very evident in the first time you meet with her, and that she's expressing worry over her children and their education. She's expressing worry over the patients she's meeting with and getting exposed to COVID and their well-being. And she's also, old behaviors have resurfaced for the first time in a while, including binge eating and purging. And this is evoking shame and self-criticism in her. Also, the recent and ongoing racial protests have triggered flashbacks and nightmares related to being harassed by peers at a predominantly white school during childhood. So she's now avoiding the news, she's avoiding social media. And previously she was interacting with her friends on social media, so she's missing that interaction. And ultimately, she'd like to be working towards racial justice and even going beyond that with social justice. She cares about being helpful to others and wishes she was more playful and present with her children. And she previously enjoyed creating art with them and going on bike rides. Okay, so this is what we have to work with. Now, how would we sort this on the matrix? What would a case conceptualization look like based upon the matrix? Well, in the lower left quadrant, once again, this is painful private events. She's feeling overwhelmed, anxious. She's endorsing and presenting with frequent worry. There's shame and self-criticism. And of course, if you were doing this in session with a client, you might use specific statements. Like, so if she's criticizing herself and saying, I'm a bad mother, you might write, I'm a bad mother in quotes on the matrix. Flashbacks, nightmares, and we can infer that there's likely sadness because she says, I'm really missing the interactions with my friends. And of course, we would check that out with the client. Is that right? Is that sadness, right? And away, what are her away moves? Well, the ones we know up front here is binge eating and purging. Now, so she, in the presence of feeling anxious and overwhelmed, She's resorting to old behaviors that are functioning to give her a little bit of relief from feeling anxious and overwhelmed. She likely experiences some short-term relief, which of course we can check that out with her with the binge eating. But then we know with binge eating, there's usually other uncomfortable feelings or thoughts that show up immediately afterwards, even just feeling very, very full. But of course, there might be other feelings like shame. And so she purges. And you can see how we can enter a vicious cycle here, right? We can create, once again, what we call a stuck loop. She's also avoiding the news and social media as well. Now, you'll notice that, and this is really important, away moves are not bad in and of themselves. I hope this, you guys, I hope I can emphasize this enough. We're not treating away moves as bad or as wrong. In functional contextualism, it's all about workability. We want to know is how are these behaviors working in the context of the client's life and in the context of their values and goals. So we'll always check this out with them. You know, what are the effects of doing these things? In fact, and avoiding the news, as an example, might be a workable thing for her to do, at least on a limited basis, right? So we'll want to check that out. Lower right quadrant. She's identified values, and we can extrapolate these values from the case presentation. It's important for her to be helpful, to be playful with her children, present and creative with them. She cares about racial justice and social connection. And then she's identified certain toward moves, making art with her children, going on bike rides with them, interacting with her friends in the past. We could also explore what would helpful behaviors look like, maybe in the context of being a nurse, maybe not. And what would actions of racial justice look like? If she was taking steps in that direction, what would that entail, right? So we can explore that with her. And of course, at the center, we're helping to train her ability to step back and notice these experiences coming up in the course of her life. So what does the actual interview look like when we are presenting the matrix? So once we've gone over the vertical and the horizontal axes, perhaps with the bunny rabbit example, or perhaps with any example you might come up with, the pen and the bunny rabbit, we can ask, oh, I should say this, traditionally, you start the interview with the matrix in the lower right quadrant. However, I don't stick with that. I usually ask them, what quadrant would you like to start in? And they pick. And of course, you need to have a little bit of flexibility with how to use the matrix to go there with them. But historically or traditionally, you might start in the lower right side here. So once again, instead of asking who or what is important to you, I'm going to ask something along the lines of, what are your heart's deepest desires for how you want to live your life? In other words, how do you want to treat yourself and others? That second version, how do you want to treat yourself and others? Clients can usually grasp that. Another way of saying it is what do you want to stand for? Like, in other words, let's say you're looking back on your life. Let's say it's 10 years from now and you're looking back on your life. What do you want to have stood for during this time in your life? Or even during the time of COVID? What do you want to have stood for as you look back? What thoughts and feelings tend to hook you or get in the way of moving toward your values? Once again, what thoughts and feelings tend to hook you or get in the way of moving toward your values? What do you do to get away or get relief from these thoughts and feelings? Or you might say, what do you do when you're under the influence of these difficult thoughts and feelings? There are two different ways of asking that question. With the first way of what do you do to get away from or get relief from, you're going to get experiential avoidance or away moves. The second part here, what do you do when you're under the influence of? You will get experiential avoidance, away moves, but you're also going to get what we can call fused behavior or hooked behavior, which means, as an example, like, well, when I'm angry, I just start snapping at people. And, you know, maybe they're having difficulty tolerating the anger, and snapping at others gives them a little bit of relief from that anger. Maybe. But maybe it's just they're acting on that anger rather than pausing, noticing, and using other mindful acceptance-based skills. So either way, you can say, what do you do when you're under the influence of this pain? And we're going to identify behaviors that are under aversive control. That's kind of what we're getting at here. And finally, what have you done or could you do to move toward or act on your values? Now, I often find that this is the hardest quadrant for people to come up with responses, especially if they're in the throes of major depression or other significant mental health issues. So we'll often need to ask this in different ways, like, you know, what would I see you doing if you were acting on these values that you identified down here? So in other words, if you're being caring or if you're being loving, what would I see you doing out in the world in your life? Or if you're being creative, or if you are being respectful or responsible, what would I see you doing at work with those values, right? So we're identifying toward moves that are happening in the world that are observable or could be observable by others. If you don't ask the questions in that kind of way, you will likely get responses that are more values. You likely get, like, when you say, what could you do to move toward your values? Well, they might say, well, I could start caring more, which is really just repeating the value. Okay, caring more about who or in what way. So you'll want to explore that with them further. And then finally, what we're going to invite them to do is, when they notice difficult thoughts and feelings coming up in their day-to-day life, can they pause? Can they step back? And there's a strategy by Russ Harris called noticing and naming. Can you notice and name whatever's showing up within you? And then pivot, right? So pivot toward your values. So I'll give you an example here. Let's say there's sadness showing up for me. And even though I'm not experiencing this now, I was experiencing a considerable amount of sadness this past spring when my sons, you know, went to distance learning, and it really wasn't a kind of a solid educational experience they were getting. And so I had some sadness there. And, you know, of course, in the presence of that sadness, I could do an away move. I could just shut down. I could avoid just talking about it. Um, you know, I might just binge out on Netflix for a little while, or I could pause, notice that sadness, and ask myself, what is right on the other side of that sadness that might be of value? In other words, our pain often holds purpose. And so in that sadness, I can recognize, well, of course, I deeply care about my son's learning. And then I might ask, well, what is one small toward move I could do today to help facilitate their learning, right? And so we call that pause and pivot. Another way of looking at that is holding and moving. Can I hold this feeling of sadness and still move in the direction of what matters to me? Can I allow this anxiety to be here as I apply for this job or go on this interview, right? Okay. So very quickly, I'm going to quickly go through these slides, these 3 slides here on verbal Aikido. And a lot of this I've already been kind of, I think, reviewing, but you'll see it in a little bit more detail here. Verbal Aikido is a term developed by Kevin Polk, Benji Schoendorf, Mark Webster, and Fabian Olaz in the book, The Essential Guide to the ACT Matrix, which is listed on the last slide of the presentation. It's essentially a yes and intervention. Aikido comes from martial arts, and verbal comes from relational framing. So what we're doing here is receiving and then redirecting energy into noticing, sorting, and choosing. So client says, you know, I'm frustrated and I can't focus. And we might ask, and where would that go on the matrix? Right? So I'm frustrated and I can't, where would that go on? Oh, that would go in the lower left quadrant. Now, of course, We're not going to do that every session, but if we're working with the matrix, we might help them to sort that experience. So that frustration, lack of focus would go, let's say, on the lower left. And then we might ask, and what do you do in the presence of frustration? You know, what would I see you doing, you know, out in your life in the presence of frustration? And then they can notice, sort that behavior, likely as an away move. And what effects have you noticed from doing X, Y, or Z? So we're getting into consequences here. What effects have you noticed from doing that? That's workability. We don't assume that it's unworkable just because they say, well, every time I'm frustrated, I go take a hit of weed. We don't assume that's unworkable. We don't know, right? Maybe they're using that in a way that is not having any significant cost in their life. In fact, I should also emphasize this. And this is where the matrix really needs to be held lightly, which is that some away moves also function as toward moves. Really, really important. And that will show up with probably every client you work with. In other words, if I'm feeling stressed at the end of the day and I take a bath to get some relief from that stress, but I also care about taking care of myself and my well-being, is that a toward move or an away move? Am I moving away from the stress or am I moving towards self-care? It could very well be both. And that's fine. Some away moves are also toward moves, and we can explore that with clients. And in fact, when that's the case, usually there isn't any cost or major cost to the away move. Yeah, so we can definitely explore that. And please know that, yes, some away moves function as toward moves as well. Oh, one other thing on that. What matters more is that if the behavior they're engaging in is under this rigid, aversive control, like every time I'm stressed, I have to leave the room. I have to go do X, Y, or Z. When there's this sort of immediate autopilot, response, that's usually the kind of away move that is more narrowing. It has a narrowing effect on their behavioral repertoire and thus on their life as a whole. So those away moves we want to pay attention to. Okay, and I kind of went over this last part here. Are you willing to carry this pain with you as you move in a value direction? All right, verbal Aikido for away moves, where we are, the aim here is to transform the function of these away moves. In other words, rather than the away moves that do have a cost, we want to explore those costs so that the client is less likely to continue engaging in those away moves going further. In other words, what once seemed appealing or neutral in effect, now becomes something that is not necessarily a behavior they want to continue engaging in. So we first validate the away moves and the short-term payoffs with respect to the context, with respect to the client's situation, their learning history, their family they grew up in, and with respect to evolution, right? Just like the bunny rabbit, we're wired to move away from pain. And then we assess the long-term effects. Have any of these away moves eliminated your painful thoughts and feelings in the long run? Or have any of these away moves made them worse over time or created new problems? And notice they're like, yeah, a lot of these have made them worse over time. Or yes, I still have high anxiety. Well, then that's where we draw their attention to the right-hand side, their toward moves. And we want to augment the reinforcing function of these toward moves by connecting their actions to intrinsic and overarching sources of reinforcement, i.e. their values. We can do that by asking, what qualities of who you want to be are you enacting in this toward move? Or what would this toward move be in the service of? How is this meaningful to you? How might these toward moves bring more fulfillment to your life in the long run? And that's key. We're helping to cultivate a longer view in terms of the effects of their behaviors, because oftentimes we are wired towards the short-term effects. So that's a big part of the work that we're doing, not to negate necessarily the short-term effects, but to also give weight to the longer-term effects. Okay, now we're going to do a little practice together. We're going to do a collective matrix here. And this is what I'm going to be inviting you to explore. In a moment, John will be opening up the chat function, and you'll be able to send chats that he will review, and he'll read some to me. And I'm going to be typing them in on a group matrix that we can all view together. So keep that in mind, that whatever you send, of course, we're not going to use any identifying names at all on the matrix that I'll be creating, but whatever you send, he might share with me, and that might go on the collective matrix. So please keep that in mind. The main and first question is going to be, what difficult thoughts and feelings have been coming up for you during the pandemic? What difficult thoughts and feelings have been coming up for you during the pandemic? Now, of course, they're likely changing all the time, but if you were to scan the last 6 months or even just the last few days and asking yourself, what have been the most recurring or the most painful? What have been the most recurring or the most painful, difficult thoughts and feelings that have been coming up? And second question will be, what do you do to avoid or to get away from this pain? What do you do to avoid? Or, hey, John,
Hey,
you
Lou.
there?
Yeah, I just wanted to say maybe we want to take the answers per question because we're going to get a lot.
Sure.
We're already getting a lot of texts. So
Yeah, I'm seeing that. That sounds good. That sounds good. All right, let me go to here, and I'll shrink that. And John, can you see the matrix that I'm going to type in right now?
yes.
Okay, great. So starting down here, what are they sharing with you, John?
Let's see. So we've got a lot of loneliness, frustration, sadness, anxiety, loneliness again, anxiety, fear, lack of motivation, helplessness, loss of control,
Wow. Yeah.
exhaustion. Uh, sort of scrolling through here.
Mm-hmm.
Those are ones that are coming up very frequently.
Mm-hmm.
Avoiding or loss of social connection,
Mm-hmm.
anger at increased work demands,
Yep.
overwhelmed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's kind of it's
Okay.
much in that vein. More fear, despair, inactivity, helplessness, that kind of.
Sure. And I'm just going to make this a little bit larger so that everyone can see here. Okay. Yeah. Um, yeah. So I'm going to invite everyone to just step back and notice. So we'll pause on sharing responses to that lower left quadrant. I'd like everyone to just notice who you are in company with today, right? And of course, some of your painful private events are going to be unique to you. And a lot of them, I imagine, are going to be commonly shared with the 200 other people on this webinar today. So just notice who we're in company with, right? And see if you can just kind of recognize that there's this sense of common humanity in what we're experiencing in the face of this pandemic. And I'll invite you, as we move forward with the matrix, to see if you can, as we allow these painful private events to be here, of course, we don't like them, we don't want them, and yet they're happening. Feeling overwhelmed, anxious, I can very much relate to those same experiences in myself, for sure. All of these, actually, I can relate to at different times. Yeah. So I'm going to invite everyone, see if we can just kind of hold this like as if we're holding our vulnerabilities, just gently holding them together as a group. And now we'll move to the upper left quadrant, which is, what kinds of things have you done to get away from or relief from these painful private events that we identified down here? And go ahead and chat them, and John will relay them to me.
Okay, we've got screen time, Netflix again, eating chocolate, withdrawing, uh, lots of Netflix and screen time. Those are very common.
Wow.
Sleeping in, sleeping more is another one that's coming up a lot. Um, Eating, drinking more, procrastination, Joining webinars. Thank you for that one. Disconnect, more video games, zone out. Baking has come up a couple times. People, cooking more, baking, that sort of thing. Reading. Again, drinking, sleeping pills, physical distraction with friends.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So we could pause there, and let me see if I can enlarge this one too. There we go. Now, so notice some of the away moves. And once again, I can relate to many of these as well, especially Netflix. And now you'll notice I put a little asterisk next to a couple of them. That was really arbitrary. What I do with clients or patients, I'll begin asking them. And so I might say, and so first I would imagine you probably have gotten some short-term relief, or I would just ask them, do you get some relief from these difficult thoughts and feelings when you do some of these things? And they'll often say yes, but they might say not all of them, but yes. And then we might put a little note or asterisk next to the ones where they do get some relief as an example. And then I might ask, which of these have had costs where you find yourself doing more and more of it to the point where you're neglecting like other parts of your life that matter to you, or where as you do these things, they're actually creating more pain down here, right? So I might ask them that question. And then I might put an asterisk or some kind of symbol next to those that have costs, okay? And then I might put a different symbol or asterisk next to those that are also functioning as toward moves, right? So once again, this is arbitrary. I have no idea if joining a webinar is a toward move for whoever may have mentioned that. Hopefully it is. And this is that I'm not just serving as a distraction from painful private events. But the point being that some of these might also be functioning as toward moves. And it could be Netflix, it could be eating chocolate, it could be any of these. I just, put a couple of examples here, but then we would check it out with the client, okay? So now we're gonna move to the lower right here. And once again, stepping back and just noticing who you're in company with. And you probably relate to at least one of these behaviors that people volunteered to put up here. Okay, so now lower right quadrant, I'm asking you, what do you want to stand for in the face of this pandemic? In other words, how do you want to be treating yourself and others? What do you want to hold dear as you orient to the situation that we're in? What qualities do you want to bring forward? Okay, and feel free to start writing in the chat function again now. And keep in mind, as John relays this to me, I'll be typing in the ones that are values. Sometimes people will share feelings, like I want to move towards feeling calm. Now, calm could still function as a value if it's a quality that we're bringing into our interactions with others. But oftentimes I find clients will look at the word calm or something like that as a feeling. So I'm going to discriminate a little bit between values and feelings as we go through this. So go ahead and type your responses in terms of the qualities that you would like to bring into your interactions.
So the ones that I'm seeing over and over again, and I'll go through some others as well, but connection and compassion are coming up very, very frequently. Self-care. Let me scroll back up here, grab a couple more. There's just compassion again. Understanding, staying healthy. Humility, gentleness, vitality. Scroll back down here more. Resilience, learning and growth, personal growth. And again, more of contribution to improving the world. That one's come up several times, along with compassion. Those are very common answers there. Let me see if there's a couple other that I may have missed. I think that kind of embodies the bulk of what we've seen so far, but there are a couple more coming in. Let me check here. Again, personal growth, coping skills, resilience. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Let's do that. Oops. Okay. Just enlarging this a little bit so everyone can see it. All right. Once again, stepping back, just noticing the values, the qualities that all of us on the call today hold dear and want to bring forth in our interactions with others, in our interacting with the world around us, and see if you can hold these values, right, in a way that kind of just honors the direction, the purpose that they're pointing us towards. And how if we begin, or as we have been, continue moving in the direction of these values, how even in the midst of the most difficult experiences, and I don't, speaking for myself, I can't recall a time in my life where I've been through 6 months of more difficult global circumstances. But even in the midst of that, we can still choose our values. We can still choose the qualities that we hold dear and bring into our lives. Okay, so finally, getting to toward moves. What actions have you taken or could you take aligned with the values below? And this can be a little bit more challenging, but see if you can name things you have done or could do that could be observable by others, where we can witness you doing X, Y, or Z. And go ahead and relay those to John.
Several instances of checking in on family or clients, exercising coming up a lot.
Yes.
Prayer and meditation, helping patients, helping neighbors, donating to causes, learning new skills. A lot of perspective taking as well. Spending time outdoors, exercise again, walking the dog, yoga. Spending time with family, either in person or by things like Zoom, if that's the way to connect. Taking a break from social media.
Okay, we can pause there. And so once again, awesome. Thank you for, let me just do this here. Awesome. I put webinar here because, right, we're learning new skills hopefully here today. And notice, once again, the webinar is on both sides, as an away move or a toward move. So awesome. Thank you so much for participating in this. Once again, recognizing our toward moves and maybe picking up on new toward moves from different people on this webinar. And then we would ask our clients, in this case, I'm going to ask you all, can you pay attention to when these different experiences are showing up in your life? And when the difficult, painful events are showing up, can you, instead of turning away from them or saying no to them, can you acknowledge them as they are? And ask yourself, what might this be telling me? And this won't apply to all of them, but what might this fear be telling me that matters to me, that's really important to me, right? And can I, and if I can identify a value here related to this painful private event, can I, the next decision I make, the next moment, can I do a toward move? Can I move in this direction, right? And that's willingness. right? So that's willingness, being willing to hold these difficult experiences as we move our lives in a direction that matters. Okay, so I'm going to move us forward here. Whoops. And we're probably going to go 5 minutes over. Okay. So for those of you familiar with the hexaflex, that's right, display settings. The hexaflex nicely overlays on the matrix here. Once again, we are aiming to cultivate psychological flexibility. And part of that is developing, someone mentioned perspective taking just now. I didn't put it in the upper right because that's like an inner behavior. And so that could be a value, like perspective taking would be could be a value. And that's what we're cultivating with self as context, helping clients to become more aware of their inner experiences, including our self stories, and then connecting or contacting the present moment. And the present moment also includes our internal experience, but oftentimes we're spending too much time in our heads. And so oftentimes we're helping our clients to orient more towards their outer or external experience. Diffusion is a term for unhooking from unhelpful thoughts. And that starts with seeing thoughts as they are. As soon as we start to introduce language in therapy, such as if someone says, yeah, I feel crazy for even considering this, we might say, so there's this thought that you see yourself as crazy, right? So as soon as we start to even use that kind of language, we're creating a context for diffusion. Acceptance is about opening up to what shows up as opposed to engaging in experiential avoidance or away moves. It doesn't mean we're not trying to eliminate all away moves either, right? Once again, some away moves don't have any costs. Values, embracing what matters in our lives. And committed action is doing what it takes. So that's where the rubber meets the road. And for those of you interested in really diving into a comprehensive introduction to ACT, once again, I'll be facilitating a course. Let me go to that real quick here, starting September 11th. It's on Fridays, same time that we met today, on Fridays, September 11th through October 16th, 6 sessions, good for 12 CEs for several mental health disciplines. You would need to check on the Praxis website for that. We have openings. I'd love to have you join me for that course. In addition to didactic and group experiences, we also do some individual one-on-one breakout sessions as well to give you a lot of practice with doing ACT clinically. We dive much further into the whole model. I give an introduction to the philosophy, theory, and technology that underlies acceptance and commitment therapy. We do revisit the matrix, and we get into more details with interventions in using the matrix derived from relational frame theory. We also work on the therapeutic relationship and the therapeutic stance. So with the matrix, usually my first, what I call life assignment, or what I'm inviting clients to do when they leave that session, is to non-judgmentally notice when you are in your head versus out in the world, and to notice when you're moving toward values versus away from pain. That's the primary intervention, and oftentimes they'll come back already beginning to make more flexible choices, which is our goal, to helping them to choose to do what matters, even in the presence of difficult experiences. And I'll leave you with a quote, which is by Georgia O'Keeffe. "I've been absolutely terrified every moment of my life, and I've never let it keep me from doing a single thing I wanted it to do." And so with that, I have some resources up on the screen for you. The first few resources are related to the matrix in particular, and then there's just some other resources up here too. I guess through the chat function, if John, if we can stay on for 5 minutes, is that okay?
Oh yeah, of course.
So we'll stay on for 5 minutes here for anyone who has comments or questions. They can do that through the chat function, and John will relay them to me, and I'll be happy to answer them. It could be about anything we did today or about the course coming up.
I will try to relay them. There
Okay.
may be many.
Yes.
So
Yes. Sure.
let me sort of
Sure.
make sure that I get that caveat in there.
Yes.
And there was one that came in earlier that I copied out. Let me get to that real quick for you here.
Okay.
Would perspective taking a willingness stance, directing attention towards the now, or diffusing be placed as examples of inner world, covert or flexible values-based behavior in the lower right quadrant? See, it
Yeah.
said in the slides that it seemed that this quadrant only filled out with values. So there's this
Yeah.
question of,
Yeah. Great question. So you just named the four sort of mindfulness processes, or these four skill sets is what I heard in that question, that relate to these four parts of the hexaflex. So those are skills or processes. And yes, those are going to generally be occurring as covert behavior or inner world experiences. Some of those could be values, but not necessarily. So skills and values are not always one and the same. Like, for instance, I tend to be pretty well organized, but that's not a value I have. Like, if you ask me 20 years from now, do I want to look back at my life and say, I'm so glad I was well organized? That's not dear to my heart, but it is a skill. So for diffusion, that might be a skill, but not necessarily a value. Acceptance, could be both. Like, I want to be more accepting towards myself and towards others. So it really depends on the client, the person we're working with. Next.
okay, here's another one. What about moves that are both for and away? How would you go about talking about this with clients, i.e. planning for the future, as someone mentioned?
Okay. So once again, I would acknowledge or validate. So sounds like that this functions, well, I might not use the word function, but else I might say it sounds like that this serves as both a toward move and an away move for you. And then we might explore context. So, like, for instance, I had a client recently tell me, she rarely drinks alcohol at all. And when she does drink alcohol recently, it's only in a social context where she met up with a friend and she had a drink with them, and it was a nice bonding experience. Whereas in the past, she would typically use alcohol as an experiential avoidance to get away from painful feelings. So in that past context, it was an away move. In this current context, it's a toward move. So we might, explore these different situations or contexts and just look at how it is functioning in their life today. And as far as going forward, I'll always invite them to be an expert of their own behavior. So to track the effects of their choices, just to track the effects. What is that like for you? What did you notice afterwards, etc. Next.
Okay, a couple more here. So the next one down was, could you please say more about how you come back to and use the matrix throughout the course of therapy? I think
Yeah,
you had
so
mentioned earlier that you use it mostly in like a session 2 or something like that.
yes, correct. So mostly I use it in the first or second session. Private practice, sometimes I'll use it in the first session. And I would say for the majority of my clients, I use it just that one time. We'll spend 50, 55 minutes on it together. And usually I'll say, so I have an option for you to choose from. We can dive into something in particular that you'd like to work on today, or I can introduce you to the matrix, which is a point of view that could be helpful in getting unstuck from patterns that are currently not working for you and helping to move toward more of what matters to you, as an example. And then they choose.
Oh,
And then in future sessions, I might revisit the matrix and say, what you just shared with me, it might be useful for us to revisit the matrix. Would it be okay if I put it up on the screen and work with it together? And so, or we'll just use it as a reference. I might just say, were you out in your head, or were you out in the world most of the time this past week, or more in your head, as an example? Yes, next.
next one was, how do you use the matrix with disorders? If,
Yeah. So, well, from a perspective of acceptance and commitment therapy, and more specifically, the philosophy that underlies ACT, disorders comes from a different sort of philosophical view, where we are looking at how people's symptoms fit into certain categories, and these categories we classify as disorders. In ACT, we're more interested in the processes that underlie all of mental health suffering, all of psychological suffering. Um, so, um, so with regards to disorders, if you're referring to things like, let's say, generalized anxiety disorder or major depression or PTSD or bipolar disorder, we're going to use the matrix in very much the same way we did today. We're exploring their painful private events, their values, toward moves and away moves, regardless of diagnosis.
And next, let's see, we've got a couple more here if you want to stay on the line.
Sure.
Let's see. So my challenge is when the person is having actual physical pain, and the client engages in away moves, taking too much pain medication, which has kept her from getting much needed help. In this case, a transplant. I feel stuck.
Yeah, I know. I've been stuck there too, for sure. Um, Especially in the context of working with physical pain folks. And I do have several patients that are struggling with physical pain and are referred to see me. And we'll do some mindful acceptance work of being able to be with their pain. And in the full ACT course, we get much more into that what that looks like. Like, we didn't do a lot of that kind of experiential mindful acceptance work today. But that's really, I think, an important skill in that context. However, in the context of the matrix, we're going to be looking at what's the effect of using these meds? Do you get short-term relief or not? And oftentimes the case, they're not even getting relief anymore. And are there any costs in the long run? Like, have you, have there been any cost to your relationships with others, to your, if they're really abusing the meds, the relationship with your doctor, or do you find yourself up worrying as, am I going to get my next refill at night? So are there other painful private events that are showing up over the long run here? And are you noticing more contact with your values or less contact with your values? So that's how I might go, in using the matrix in that context.
Okay, and one more here. I think I don't want to keep folks too long, but let's see. We've got one asking, what about when clients don't think something is an away move, when you believe clearly that it is, and they therefore lack motivation to change it?
That's a great question. Um, I'm never going to try to force or coerce a client into believing what I believe. Okay. And from the perspective of ACT, we don't do that. Rather, I'm going to continue to ask questions, help them to explore what we call the antecedents and the consequences of their away moves, of their behaviors. And I would say 90% of the time, over time, they are able to see that it's an away move that has costs, just by revisiting it over time. And I could think of many, many examples where that's happened. Yes, sometimes there might be a struggle or some resistance with exploring that, and I don't push it too far. I mean, I'll probe a little bit. I'll push just a little bit, but only to the point where they're willing to go there with me. And if they're clearly not willing, I'll kind of file it and come back to it at a later time. And ultimately, I'm interested, okay, if that's not an away move, what would be important for them to work on in therapy together? Like, what are their goals? What would they like to ultimately get out of therapy? And I'm going to frame that as behavioral goals. So in other words, 6 months from now, after working together, what will we see you doing differently as a result of our work together that would tell us that this has been helpful to you, right? So we talk about this in the ACT course at great extent, but how to develop collaborative behavioral goals with the client. And that's what I'm going to focus on. And whether those away moves resurface or not, often ends up not mattering. We, as a clinician, we might get fused with this idea of like, I have to focus on their, abuse of substances. But from our perspective in ACT, that's not necessarily the case. As long as we're working with their behavior and helping them to develop more flexible responses, which could come in very, very small steps, I'm on board. So I think we should probably wrap it up, John.
Yeah, unless there was one last question if you want to address it.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Last question.
What about competing values? How do you process these with clients?
We get into that too in the full ACT course. My first response is, oftentimes competing values is really about competing domains. So for instance, family versus work, or versus health, or versus community. It's usually more a matter of competing domains, and then it's about how we devote our time and attention to those domains. However, in the case of competing values, once again, this is where situation or context is really important. I like this metaphor of imagining a round globe. So a globe that spins like the Earth globe. And you can imagine, like, let's say 7 continents. We have these 7 core values as an example. Um, and, and so sometimes the one particular value you might want to look at and spin the globe that way, because in this situation, that's what's called for. That is what's going to help you to live the life you want to live, or to move your life in a meaningful and fulfilling direction. Whereas in this situation, we might want to turn the globe a little bit to the side and say, oh, that's actually the value that I want to stand for in this situation. It's not always that clear. And once again, it's usually about competing domains.
All right, and with that, thank you, Lou, from us here at Praxis for doing this presentation today. And thank you everyone here for joining us. And for those of you who are here with us after time, we appreciate your attention. And I believe that's pretty much it. We'll see Lou back here in a couple of weeks. And the rest of you, just be safe out there. Take care of yourselves.